There's a saying in sports, the best ability is availability. That phrase holds true in the fantasy community too, which is why Ben Dinnery has more than 100,000 followers on Twitter and is one of the most trusted sources when it comes to Premier League injury news. In this episode of The Beautiful Fantasy Game, I'll be speaking with Ben Dinnery, founder of Premier Injuries and a social media must-follow for any FPL manager. If you're wondering about a player's injury status for the upcoming game week, he's the one who will have the answers for you. Okay, Ben, thank you so much for doing this. We've got to get to the background first, the root of it all. When did you start taking an interest in reporting football injuries?
Back in the day, so my roots go back to physioroom.com. So physioroom.com was the original go-to injury website. And that dates back to almost, the very early noughties, 2000, 2001. A bunch of us went to university. Long story short, you're having a few beers on a Friday night. Fantasy was just coming to the fore. It wasn't big, but it was bubbling underneath the surface. And we were having a conversation about, availability, players' injuries, our hometown club, which was Newcastle United. And we were talking about, who we think would play and who would not for our fantasy team. Well, a friend of ours was at university across in Manchester, and he was actually on placement with Manchester United. And as part of that placement, he had been travelling with the youth team, with the development squad, and he got to know a few of the physios, a few members of the backroom staff, medical teams, and he just sort of came up and went, well, why don't I just give him a call? I'll send him a text message or what have you, and we'll find out if he's available, see what we can do. So that's how, that was the initial conversation, and that's how it started. And from there, we ended up doing a show with a UK-based sports radio station, TalkSport, where on a Friday evening, we used to go through each Premier League fixture, talk about, the team news, players who are likely to miss out. And we created the first injury table, as it were. It was very crude, very basic. And then all of a sudden, all of these people wanted to see this injury table, and we were generating massive amounts of traffic. People wanted to see, they wanted help with the fantasy team, and it just grew exponentially from there. Cousins, friends moved down to London. I moved back up to my hometown in Newcastle, and we went our separate ways for a little bit. But then in around about 2009-10, I got back involved with PhysioRoom. And PhysioRoom by this stage was really an e-commerce website. So it was about selling products, and it's still done the injury table, and we still done the injuries, but it wasn't up front and center. It wasn't about the data as such. It was about just creating a hook that would bring people to the site to hopefully convert into buying products. When I came on board, I said, look, all I'm interested in is the data and the actual injuries themselves. Can I make that my baby? That's what my passion is. I'll look after the social media. I'll look after the injury table, and I'll talk about, injuries. And I'll be the face of almost physioroom.com in terms of all of the media deliveries, any data requests, all the fantasy involvement. And that's really where my involvement and how my passion really started to grow from that point.
And shortly after that, you launched premierinjuries.com. How has that become the source now for player injury news? How did this come about, and how did it take off so quickly?
Yeah, so I think, I was a couple of years down the line with PhysioRoom. And like I say, while I was collecting the data, I always felt that I wanted to do more with it. And PhysioRoom was solely interested in just the e-commerce. And at the time, it was hard to attribute any kind of value to the data at all. Who wants it? Who would pay for it? It's a lot of time. It's a lot of resource. It's a lot of effort, first and foremost. So I decided, well, if PhysioRoom aren't necessarily interested in doing that type of thing, well, I'll create Premier Injuries, and I'll make it all about the injuries. And I always go back to the old analogy. It's like the field of dreams. Nobody wanted it, but I created something, and they will come. Yeah. And I've been fortunate that I've been able to create a website which people are interested in, and we're a bit of a media go-to. We work at such a diverse range of organizations and people. It's mind-blowing, from sports litigation to insurance brokers to clubs to medical teams, universities, fantasy players, gambling, you name it. We cut across a huge section of of the community. And that's really what drives me, and that's what my passion is.
But Ben, it started with the fantasy community, right? The interest from the fantasy community. Did you expect that at the time, that there'd be such a thirst for this knowledge and understanding of these player injuries, and then you could cater your content to that audience?
Yeah, I mean, the fantasy always remains as a nucleus of the website. They underpin it. They're the people that drive everything from a day-to-day basis. Everything else is a bonus. We knew early doors with physioroom.com, the numbers that we were generating, 7 figures across the month. We knew that there was an interest there. And it was maybe about developing that and gleaning that and trying to use that as we move forward. With Premier Injuries, like I say, because we already had that grounding and that understanding of the audience, and fantasy by this time was gaining a little bit of momentum. We've seen some of the big hitters come on board, the Sky, the Telegraph, and Yahoo, Roto World, and then obviously the Premier League. And as that grew, our audience grew as well. And we've come a long way, and hopefully over the next maybe 12 to 18 months, we will be moving forward and almost to a Premier League and version 2, and really looking at taking the brand forward and delivering a lot more in terms of injury data insights.
Oh, it's exciting, Ben. So there's obviously stiff competition now as the community grows and as more people are creating this sort of content. So what separates you from your competition? What do you pride yourself on?
I mean, I would love to say, we've got the Midas touch and there's something magical about it. We're dealing with injuries first and foremost, so that we are bound in terms of information that you can release, information that you can get, just because of, confidentiality and what the clubs will allow you to have access to. So, for the large part, there's a lot of information out there that can be publicly obtained. But, you've got to be diligent. There are a lot of fake news reporting, and I think you've got to maintain that level of consistency. Yeah. It's 7 days a week. It's 365 days a year. Unlike maybe those fantasy specific websites and stuff, we're dealing with injuries across the board. And because we have a number of different clients in different areas, we have to track players out of season, European tournaments, international tournaments, pre-season, training. So, we literally are working around the clock, all day, every day, to ensure that we have the latest and most accurate injury data database to hand.
All right, here's one that's pretty much every amateur footballer has done. You're watching the match on TV, and I've done this because I feel like I've sustained pretty much every footballing injury. You make a call, you see a guy pull at his hamstring, and right away you go, oh, there goes his hamstring. How quickly do you make those calls when you're watching, and how accurate are you with those TV assessments?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be very, very careful in terms of, and I've learned the hard way over the years, in terms of making those maybe snap judgments, because I've got quite a large social media following, and people are very quick to jump on board these days if you get the slightest thing wrong. So and also as well, you have to be very wary of the fact that we're talking about footballers. We are well positioned, and we are highly thought of. And there have been instances where we've reported injuries, and clubs have said, look, can you remove that, because the player's going through a difficult moment at this time, and media outlets and journalists are always looking for something to hang a story onto. So yeah, I mean, we do make calls, but in my own mind now, I tend to think that unless I'm fairly certain
Yeah.
I will hold my own court. I will, keep that. There are a lot of accounts out there, doctors, orthopedic surgeons, who will make those instant calls.
Yeah, and I'm not saying you should make these calls and post it publicly. I'm just saying in your own home, on your comfy couch, and you're like, oh, that's definitely that. And I just want to know how accurate you are with those assessments.
The run-of-the-mill, the day-to-day injuries, they're fairly easy to pick up, if you're talking about in terms of hamstring muscular problems. Looking at the mechanism of injury is always a good indicator. The way a player maybe kick the ball or the way they've run in or a slip, then you can make a fairly good, educated guess. And, you very rarely... You're never too far away. You can normally narrow it down to maybe 2 or possibly 3, potential issues with any particular injury.
Okay, now to some FPL advice here. I'm trying to know which players or which type of injuries I should be wary of, especially when I'm thinking about a player that's coming back from this injury. Even though they're available to play, they probably aren't playing the full 90, and it'll take them a little while to recover. So what injuries should I be wary of when I'm playing FPL?
Hamstring injuries, high prevalence and high, re-injury recurrence rates. You're talking about, a high percentage of those will, reoccur within the first 30 days. So you need to be wary of players that are maybe, being rushed back and thrown in at the deep end. But it's often it's bigger than the individual and the injury as well. Consider maybe clubs that they're playing for. Consider the player's status within that team. I'm just looking ahead of maybe this season. So somebody like maybe Brentford and Ivan Toney, his status within, that starting 11 will be very, very high. Harry Kane's is very high within Tottenham Hotspur currently. There will be a need or a necessity to rush them back and maybe throw them straight back into the starting 11. Whereas if maybe you're looking at a Manchester United and Cavani picked up an injury, Ollie's going to be thinking, well, I've got Martial, I've got Rashford, I could put maybe Dan James up there. I have other options. So sometimes it's about, not just looking at the player and the individual injury itself, but, considering the wider implications of the team and the managers and the coaches and understanding the decision-making process behind the scenes.
That's a great point, considering the managers. I don't think Ollie trusts any of the other players, so I think he'd probably thrust Cavani back out there. So
yeah, quite possibly.
Yeah. So you talked about clubs there. Which clubs are better at dealing with injuries, either on the prevention side or on the recovery end? So which clubs are better at it, or which clubs struggle with it?
Very difficult question to answer.
You get yourself in trouble, I guess, if you answer it incorrectly.
What I would say about, and this is, part of the website that when it was first started, we wanted to educate almost the masses. And because you see a lot of headlines, you see that clubs have a bad injury record as such, and it's the medical teams that face the flak. Such and such is injured again. That physiotherapist is rubbish. The medical department are crap. But ultimately, it's the medical department aren't working on the training pitches. They're not managing players' loads. They're not working with, they're not, maybe final decision lies with the coach or the manager. They could go against medical advice. What I would say about, it's particularly clubs in the Premier League, they are well-resourced, well-funded. They are, up the upper end in terms of cutting-edge technology. In terms of managing, and it again, it's football is a contact sport.
Yeah.
First and foremost. So if you don't want to get injured, you don't play.
Right.
And it sounds fairly obvious and basic, but first and foremost, what you need to understand is, and with all due respect, sometimes it just comes down to recruitment and the player themselves, and it doesn't matter what happens behind the scenes. Look, if you look at Jack Wilshere, for example, across his career, he might have an availability record of around about 50 to 60%, roughly off the top of my head. I'm thinking in terms of his Premier League. Now, if you were to sign Jack Wilshere, then it would be unrealistic to think that you could suddenly turn Jack from a 50 to 60% player up to a 80 or a 90 or a 95% player, because history will tell us, is a good indicator that his body just isn't able to tolerate and cope with the demands of Premier League football. Not once a week, maybe that it used to be, sometimes twice, and even sometimes 3 games a week now. So the game's changed. The game's a lot more dynamic. It's very explosive. So I think it's recruitment. But if you look at what the data would tell us in recent times, Wolverhampton Wanderers are up there in terms of managing the squad. There are big elements of luck involved in that. Of course they are. We talk about Wolves, but Raul Jimenez is a player that springs to mind, just that sort of sickening clash with David Luiz, and that's him sort of out for the remainder of the season. And it was career threatening. Things like, if we look at the Euros, you look at Christian Eriksen. We all seen those tragic events unfold, stuff that you cannot legislate for. But in some people's eyes, if you were to look at the hard data in just black and white, that might not reflect it well against the medical team in terms of the layman. So I think you need to look at, again, individuals, clubs, and looking at how they're managing. You can't really compare. You always tend to see Newcastle, Manchester United are a club that have typically a high number of reported injuries across a season, but then they also play the most games.
That's right. Yeah,
of a lot of teams.
Consider that exactly.
Yeah, so they're running deep in domestic competition, they're running deep in European competition, as well as the Premier League.
So what's Newcastle's excuse then? No, I'm just joking around.
Well, it's a vicious circle as well. Yeah. You talked about clubs with maybe limited budget, so high profile, high status players. When you're lower end of the table, and we mentioned just before we came on air of Alan Saint-Maxim. When Steve Bruce is looking at planning his team and his starting 11 for games in the season, he will earmark, we want 3 points here, we want 1 point here, and we need to go out and get that. Now, at some points, you're going to be taking risks with players because ultimately you are judged on results, and if you drop out of the Premier League or you're going out, then you're out of a job. So decisions are player led, but also they're in consultation with the medical departments, the coaches and the managers. There is a duty of care, but it's all one big fine balancing act. So
who else? Fantasy managers have to make difficult decisions as well. And they're obviously often seeking advice from you. So what's the strangest, most obscure question you've received on social media from a fantasy manager?
From a fantasy manager? I quite often, who's going to, I wouldn't even say it's obscure, but, who's going to score this weekend? Who's going to score the most points? And I'd go
straightforward.
Just who's it? I remember, there was a point in it, he said, how many minutes is Sergio Aguero going to play? And I said, he's coming back from injury. I said, typically I would expect, maybe 60, 65 minutes and then brought off. But you need, again, consider the context of the game.
Yeah.
I think he went out and I think he played 85 minutes. As soon as that final whistle went, social media was like, what, you lying there? And you just get a torrent of abuse.
Of course.
So those are sort of bread and butter questions as well. That come in.
Definitely.
If I had a crystal ball and I could predict the future, then I certainly wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, you and me both, my friend. All right, what impresses you the most about the FPL community on social media?
I think the community's grown. The community itself is. It just seems to be. Grown exponentially in terms of just the numbers, the vast number of players involved, but the knowledge, and also the amount of work that these people are prepared to put in. And I've been there and done it myself. I think for almost sort of 3-4 years, there's almost this expectation that you're producing everything and it's all just done in the hope that you maybe score some work off the back of it. And people are out there, doing this. Hour upon hour, previews, research, data-driven insights. They're sharing it within the community. It's all free. It's available. And they're just doing it because, they have this passion and they want to share that knowledge. And I think that's to be commended. That's a really big positive in terms of, and we hear a lot about social media. We hear a lot about the bad side of it, the trolls and the abuse. And yes, that goes on, and there are elements that maybe blow up every now and again, but for the large part, it manages itself really quite well. And there are a fairly close-knit bunch, and for the most part, they're just there to share a passion, to talk about a game they absolutely love, and they get along. Everybody seems to get along pretty well.
It's been pretty impressive for myself to see and witness as well. Last question here, Ben. Thank you so much for doing all of this as well. It's been really great. What advice would you give to someone who's looking to start a project to create some content involving fantasy Premier League?
Yeah, good question. What we've noticed, or what I've noticed over the years, and what we will see at the beginning of this season, we will see lots of accounts popping up. There's lots of opinions. If you're looking to make a splash and make, get your foot in the door, as it were, a couple of things. Pick something that you're passionate about, because, it's all great in the early days, a month and 2 months and 3 months and 4 months. Anybody can do that. But it's when the games are coming thick and fast every night on occasions, we've seen during the pandemic, when it's dark and it's raining and you've been out the night before and you're tired and you can't be bothered, you need to have that self-driven motivation to still continue to produce that content, be consistent. And I think, having something that you're really passionate about and something that you enjoy doing helps, a hell of a lot. And try to think of something which is maybe, unique, something which is different to what else is going on out there. Difficult, I know, but like I say, if you're producing good quality content, it may not happen overnight, but people will slowly start to pick up on the good work that you're producing. You get that momentum and you will begin to grow. But like I say, it's the consistency and the quality which will help you, get attract those numbers and keep you going.
Well, you certainly have those boxes checked, Ben. Thank you so much for doing this. This was a pleasure. We'll have to do this again. Appreciate it.
Look forward. Yeah, no problem. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
So the importance of being available is not only applicable to athletes. Ben has shown me that by consistently giving your audience the information that they seek, you can build a large, faithful following and successful business. The next episode of the Beautiful Fantasy Game podcast will look at the history of FPL, so keep an ear out for that. Till then, enjoy your day. Take care.